We are in the book of Genesis, and we are in the second half of the life of Joseph, which is the climax and the end of the book of Genesis. Next week will be our last message in this series, and we will kind of have a review, overview, look at some of the things we learned from the beginning and see if we can get a picture of the whole book of Genesis and what its message is. But today we're going to finish up Joseph. So last week we looked at his story to begin with, the first half of his life. And so Joseph's story is pretty well known, and many of you will know the outline. There are some of you who don't know the outline that well. We'll go over that in a minute. But if there are things that you don't understand, I can't go into every detail of Joseph's story today or last week. So if there are pieces you don't understand, make sure you go back and watch the last message or just go through and read. It's quite a few chapters in Genesis, all the way, I think it starts in chapter 37, his life. We'll be in chapter 40 today, and then all the way up to chapter 50, the end of the book. But first, let's look at some Joseph and archaeology. We did a little bit of this last week, and I got to tell you, this is a bit dangerous because right now my mind is just bursting full of ancient Egyptian history. And so hopefully I won't get too caught up in it. But it's a lot of fun. All right, so I showed you this guy last week. This is Dr. Bob Breyer. And I've read a couple of his books, an audio course that he does. It's like a university-level series of lectures on the history of ancient Egypt. He is kind of a famous Egyptologist. His nickname is Mr. Mummy, and you'll see why in a minute. I might have told you last week, but you'll see why in a minute. Here, we went over this last week. This is his overall take. He's not a Christian. This is his overall take as an Egyptologist on the story of Joseph as it's written in the Bible. His overall take is that the story of Joseph was clearly written by someone who knew Egypt in that time period. Clearly written by someone who knew Egypt. Now, we went over a couple pieces last week. Here's a couple interesting pieces, and we'll come back to some of these as we go through the message. But things that are connections between ancient Egyptian history and what we find in the story of Joseph in the Bible. This one is really interesting. It's the word abrek. And this word appears in the Hebrew text. It appears in the section where, you remember the story of Joseph, and Pharaoh gives him power over all of Egypt, and then he goes around collecting grain, and then because it's 7 years of plenty, and then it's 7 years of famine, and he goes around giving out the grain. Well, as he goes around Egypt with all of Pharaoh's stuff, this ring, Pharaoh's signet ring, a robe, a chariot, all the Egyptian people bow down before him and they cry out, abrek. Now, it's a really interesting word because it's not Hebrew. And the question is, what in the world is it? And most Egyptologists think that it's a slight variation on an Egyptian phrase, an ancient Egyptian phrase that means your heart to you. It's sort of like saying, God bless you, or, vaya con Dios, right? Like go with God. And so this is real Egyptian that is recorded in Genesis that the Egyptian people were crying out to Joseph as he went around. The Egyptians believed that you thought with your heart. What we think happens in your brain, they thought happened in your heart to you. Amazing. Another really interesting connection in the text, this one is fascinating to me. So you know the scene, we'll go through it today, where Joseph is in front of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's guys, Pharaoh has had these dreams, and no one can interpret them. No one knows what the dreams mean. Well, it says when he calls these people, actually it's before Joseph gets there, when he calls all of his wise men to interpret his dreams, the Hebrew text calls them magicians. Okay, he calls all of his magicians to interpret his dream. And that's a fairly accurate depiction because the ancient Egyptians believed in magic, like they really believed in magic. Everything was magic spells to them. Well, the Coptic text does not say magicians. So what does that mean? Coptic is actually the modern form after ancient Egyptian, right? Languages keep changing a little bit, but it eventually became called Coptic, right? Coptic is the modern form of ancient Egyptian. And there is an ancient translation of the Hebrew text into Coptic. And in just that part in the text, it doesn't say magicians. It says in Coptic, the scribes of the house of life. Why? Most Egyptologists, Bob Breyer thinks it's because the Coptics, being Egyptians, they knew who Pharaoh really called. He called a particular group of priests, and they corrected it. It's not just magicians. He called the scribes of the house of life, a particular group of priests who were trained in dream interpretation. That's stunning. Stunning. Here's another amazing little connection, archaeology. This is on I don't know how to say it, Sehel Island or Sehel Island. And this is the very famous famine stela. So it is a carving into the rock. This island is, it's near Aswan, so it's way upstream in the Nile, like on the very borders of Egypt. And it records, in the Bronze Age, a 7-year famine. Does that sound familiar? In the whole land of Egypt, a 7-year famine. And it's very unusual because Egyptians almost never recorded bad news. Almost never. And so it seems like in some way this must have actually been good news. How could a 7-year famine be good news? Maybe if Pharaoh had enough grain to feed everybody and then he became ultra powerful as a result. Amazing. And this is the last piece of archaeology and Joseph for today. And this you're going to see. How long does it take to make a mummy? 40 days or 70 days. So this was a big debate for a long time in Egyptology because there are ancient sources that say it took the Egyptians 40 days to mummify someone. And there are also ancient sources that say it took them 70 days to mummify someone. So how long did it really take? So you know Egyptian mummies. I mean, they're a little gruesome. I won't give you the most gruesome pictures. This is the most famous mummy in the world. Who do you think this is? This is Tutankhamun. This is his mummy. It's a little bit closer picture. It's amazing. I mean, it's a little gruesome, but you can actually still get a sense of what he looked like. Their mummification process was intense. There's tons of Egyptian mummies. This is the most famous mummy because it was found undisturbed, and he's a pharaoh. But there are hundreds and hundreds of ancient Egyptian mummies. Here's another one that's from an official, but not a pharaoh. Some of them are very well preserved. Look at that thing. We're talking about thousands of years old. They're amazing. How long did it take to make a mummy? So Bob Breyer, in 1994, Bob Breyer and Ron Wade made a mummy in the Egyptian way, for real. They got a body, a cadaver, that had been donated to science. And so this guy's like a surgeon, and Bob Breyer's an Egyptologist, and they mummified it using the Egyptian process. And they learned all kinds of things as they did that. And one of the things they learned is it takes 40 days to make a mummy, not 70. So what were the other 30 days for? Here's what it says in Genesis 50. Did you know Jacob, Joseph's dad, was mummified? He was mummified like this. Jacob, look at Genesis 50. Joseph directed the physicians. At this point, he is a high official in Egypt, the highest official. Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. That's Jacob. They're going to mummify Jacob. The physicians embalmed him. Why? He did this so that he could take his dad back to Canaan and bury him with Abraham and Isaac, and the body wouldn't decay on the way. Taking a full 40 days. For that was the time required for the embalming. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Why do the ancient sources, why are they all confused about 40 days or 70 days? Genesis 50 gives the answer. It took 40 days to make a mummy, but the whole process, the whole funeral service, and all of the different things that they did to mourn for the dead person took 70 days. And that's why there's a debate in the sources. Genesis is right. Surprise, surprise. Oh, so good. Okay, we got to move on from the straight up history. Let's jump back into the story here. We're in this series. I won't tell you all about this series again. Let's remember the outline of Joseph's story. So we got to hold it in our heads. We can't go into detail about all of it because it's really long. It's a huge part of the point of Genesis. But here's the outline. We looked at this last week, all right? So Joseph, this is his life. When he's 17 years old, and these first few, the first three especially, are the ones we went over last week. So Joseph has all these dreams when he's 17. He's got 11 brothers, and his brothers don't like him. They're not really very good guys, most of them. Some of them are really dangerous guys. And Joseph has these dreams in which it appears that his brothers are bowing down to him. One of them is like the sheaves of grain. His sheaf stands up. The other 11 sheaves bow down to him. The other one is stars and the sun and moon. And everybody's bowing down to Joseph in these dreams. And Joseph goes and tells his brothers the dreams. And what do? They get more mad at him. They eventually beat him up, throw him in a pit, and then they sell him as a slave to some traders who take him to Egypt. And then he ends up in Potiphar's house. We talked about that last week. There is one theme that I will remind you of in this first part, is that one of his dreams, the sun and moon, are bowing down to him. And a lot of people, including his dad Jacob, thought that dream meant that his parents would be bowing down to him. I don't think so. I think it means Egypt, Pharaoh, and the people of Egypt. I think that's what it means. Why? Because Pharaoh was the embodiment of the sun god. And the people of Egypt were sometimes represented as by the moon, right? Being a pair, right? Pharaoh and the people. So I think it means the people, the Pharaoh of Egypt and the people of Egypt. And then there's kind of a theme running through this. Potiphar means given by Re, the sun god. So the theme is whenever Joseph sees like the sun god or the sun showing up in some way in his life, he sees God's hand at work because of that dream that he had. So things go really well in Potiphar's house. He becomes this basically ruler or CEO of Potiphar's little dominion there. But then Potiphar's wife isn't very nice to him. And, well, she wants to be nice to him, but then it doesn't work out. Joseph's not into that. And then she frames him for attacking her, and he gets thrown in prison. And where we left Joseph last week was the dungeon dreams, right? So he's in a dungeon. And the amazing thing about Joseph is he gets it, right? Joseph understands what took his great-grandfather Abraham a really long time, 100 years to understand this. Took his dad maybe until he was in his 50s to get this. Joseph gets it at 17 years old, that God is with him. That even when bad things happen, everything's under God's control, and God's going to make it turn out good in the end. And so even thrown into a dungeon, he doesn't seem to waver. Now, I'm sure he didn't like it. He goes through immense suffering in his life. That doesn't mean he just had fun all the time when he was suffering. But his faith does not waver. He's in the dungeon. He says, well, here I am. God's still here with me. We're going to see that in just a minute. So we're going to talk about these stories. He interprets some dreams of people in the dungeon. They're high officials of Pharaoh. Then he's going to get presented to Pharaoh himself. He's going to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. He's going to be made the ruler of all Egypt, not above Pharaoh, but second in command to the entire country of Egypt. And through that, he's going to save the whole nation from a famine. And then in the end, his brothers are going to come back because now they're starving, and Joseph's in control of Egypt, and he's got all this food, and he's going to save the lives of his entire family. He's going to forgive his brothers. Stunning. They tried to kill him. He's going to forgive them. Would you forgive your siblings if they actually tried to kill you? And then sold you as a slave? Would you forgive them? Joseph gets it. Here's the points. You can write down some of these in your notes, but I'm going to go through fast because we need to get to the meat of this. Joseph walks with God. These points are all the same point. They're all the same point, just different ways of saying it. This is what he gets. He learns how to walk, how to live with God as his friend, his partner in life. Joseph lets God be in control. Joseph doesn't try to control his own life. He tries to do good, but he doesn't try to control it. He decides to let God lead his life. He makes that decision, I think maybe even before he's 17, because he's seen how bad it is when his parents and grandparents fought God for so many decades. Joseph says, I'm not doing that. I'm going to serve God even in my youth. Joseph gives his life to God. These are different ways of saying the same thing. Joseph trusts God. Okay, I'm in a dungeon. God must hate me. No. I trust you. I'm in a dungeon. God still loves me. Joseph follows God. He's looking for things God is doing in his life. Whenever he sees something connected to one of those dreams God gave him, he's like, here we go. Here we go, guys. God's about to do something. Joseph learns from God. We're going to see Joseph interprets these dreams. Every time he interprets dreams, he says, dream interpretation belongs to God. Only God can do it. And then Joseph just immediately does it. He doesn't pray. He doesn't ask God. He doesn't go read the Bible. None of that. He just interprets the dream. How? Because he spent his whole life learning from God. Joseph believes. This is what it means to believe, to have faith. All right, let's jump into the dungeon dreams. This is where we left off last time. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the chief baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Joseph came to them the next morning. He saw they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, why do you look so sad today, guys? Why are you so sad? They're in a dungeon. He's asking them why they're sad. We both had dreams, they said. They answered, but there's no one to interpret them. Joseph said to them, don't the interpretation of dreams belong to God? Tell me your dreams. I'll interpret them right now. Okay. Now, a couple of things about this. Actually, there's a lot here. Oh, man. How can I tell you everything that's here? First of all, these are not just like waiters in Pharaoh's household. The cupbearer of the king of Egypt, yes, sort of officially his job is to bring Pharaoh his wine in a cup. But that's not all he does. He is a high official in the Egyptian government, right? You can think of Pharaoh kind of like a gangster who doesn't have anyone keeping him in check, right? Imagine a gangster becomes the king of the world, right? So what is the gangster? His right-hand man, what's he going to do? Bring me my beer, right? So that's really what it's like. So here, this gives you an idea of what kind of high official this was. This is the lotus cup. This was found in Tutankhamun's tomb. This is what the high official, the cupbearer, would have carried around. Not only is this super impressive, this is made out of pure alabaster, carved alabaster. Not only is it super expensive, super impressive, it was considered a magical item. It was an item of magical power. So these people weren't as powerful as Pharaoh, obviously, but they were very powerful. They were probably the two most powerful officials in the government. Okay? The baker is no different. Maybe not quite as powerful as the cupbearer, but it does not just mean he's baking some bread, right? He is a high official in the Egyptian government. Okay, so that's important. So when Joseph sees these guys, he sees he's been put in prison. He's like, okay, I'm in a dungeon, but God's still here with me. He's going to do something. I know eventually the sun and the moon somehow are going to come bow down to me. And then he's promoted in the dungeon, and then all of a sudden, two high officials are thrown into jail with him, and they're put in his custody. He's a prisoner, and they're put under his authority. Here's the two guys you're going to guard. They're servants of the sun god. They are servants of Ra, the sun god. What does Joseph think? My God is about to do something. That's what he thinks. For sure. He is so interested and excited when these guys show up in the prison. So he goes up to them. Well, they have a dream. They have a dream on the same night. And the next morning, Joseph sees them, and they are super sad. Now, why would they be sad just because they had a dream? Why would that be? If you woke up and you and maybe your friend or your spouse had a similar dream on the same night, would that make you really sad? Probably not. You just think it was interesting. They're sad, they say, because there is no one to interpret the dreams. This is important for understanding the whole story. The Egyptians believed that dreams always meant something. We're talking about one of the most superstitious, magical-minded countries in the history of the world. Everything was considered to be magic. Every dream was considered to be a prediction of the future. Every dream. They have a dream on the same night. Both of them feel like this dream's got to mean something. But you don't just interpret dreams on your own in Egypt. We'll see that when we get to Pharaoh. You had to go to the scribes of the house of life. You had to go to special magical priests to interpret your dream. Regular people, not just anybody can interpret a dream. That's not how it worked. So there's no one there. There's no priest in the dungeon. So they just assume we cannot figure this out. Our gods are not just going to speak to us. And Joseph looks at them and he says, if I'm going to paraphrase this, here's what he says. Guys, cheer up. God is right here with us. The real God is here in this dungeon. And interpretation of dreams belong to him, not to your weird magic priests, okay? Tell me your dreams. So he interprets the dreams, okay? We are going to jump forward here, and we're going to jump all the way to the throne room. Most of you know the story about how he interprets the dreams in the dungeon, right? The dreams they're a pair, and they both have a 3 in them. One has 3 vines, the other has 3 baskets of bread. The guy's like the baker's trying to balance 3 baskets of bread on his head. And Joseph immediately tells them, without consulting God, anything else, he says, I know what your dreams mean. The 3 means 3 days. It means something is about to happen almost immediately to you. And one of you is going to die, and the other one is going to become a high official again. It also shows you what Pharaoh was like. What Pharaoh actually does right after that is Pharaoh throws a big party, and as sort of the centerpiece of his big party, he calls his 2 high officials up from the dungeon, and he promotes one, you're back in the government, and the other one, you get impaled on a stake. This is the centerpiece of Pharaoh's dinner party. You want to go to Pharaoh's dinner party? Probably not. He is not a nice guy, okay? Pharaoh is not a nice guy. And that's important to remember because you are about to see how bold Joseph is. Joseph is not, no one even talks to Pharaoh like he's a real person. We were talking about this in Bible study this morning. They are so terrified of him, even the most powerful people in Egypt. Joseph is about to get drug out of this dungeon, and he talks to Pharaoh like Pharaoh's just a regular guy. You're not a god. I know God. You're not him. Here's what happens next. He sits in the dungeon for 2 more years. 2 more years. You would think the guy would have helped him get out. The guy who was promoted would have helped him get out of the dungeon. Nope. Does Joseph lose faith during these 2 more years? What's something you've been waiting for a long time for God to do for you? 2 years. Doesn't seem to waver in his faith at all. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile River when out of the river came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile. Ugly cows. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. That actually sounds like kind of a terrifying dream. Ugly cows devouring fat cows? Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream on the same night. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing out of a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for his magicians, the scribes of the house of life, and wise men of Egypt. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Okay, several things here. First of all, what kind of a government was this? Pharaoh has 2 dreams on the same night, and it is a national emergency. It is. Sometimes we complain about our government, but it's better than this. We do not have a national emergency when Trudeau has a dream, okay? So Pharaoh, he's like a gangster with nobody keeping him in check, and they believe he is the embodiment of the sun god on earth. He has a double dream, everybody's freaking out. He's calling in, these guys are rousted out of it. It's a national emergency. The second thing, and this is something that has often puzzled people. It puzzled me for a long time, till this month, actually. It puzzled Dr. Bob Breyer as he read, as an Egyptologist, reading this story, and I think he's given us the answer. And we're going to go over that in a minute. Why, here's the puzzle, why can his magicians not interpret the dream? It seems like, if there's a national emergency and gangster Pharaoh who impales people on stakes is calling you up, tell me this dream right now, aren't you just going to make something up? Like something. Are you going to really look at the sun god, the guy who thinks he's God on earth, and tell him, I don't know how, I know it's my whole job to know how to do this, but I don't have any idea what your dream means. Furthermore, the dream doesn't seem, it could have lots of different interpretations, sure, but it's not like that hard to come up with some kind of interpretation, right? 7 ugly cows eating 7 healthy cows. Okay, let's come up with something. No, they can't come up with anything. Why? Why can't they interpret the dream? These are the people that the high officials wanted. They were sad in the dungeon because they couldn't get to these scribes of the house of life to interpret the dream. But why can't the scribes interpret it? Here's the answer. Egyptians didn't make anything up. Ancient Egyptian society and magic and their religion, it was one of the most conservative environments in the history of the world. They never changed anything. For 3,000 years, the Egyptians had the same art. If you look at art from the time of Cleopatra or art from the very first pharaohs, it's identical, almost identical. They didn't change anything. Their magic spells, they believed the magic spells had power because they were super, super old. This is in the British Museum. It is part of a set of papyri found in Egypt, and it is one of many instances of a magical Egyptian dream book that had been discovered. It is a magic scroll that tells you how to interpret dreams. Notice some of the words on the scroll are in red ink. Do you see that? This would have been immensely valuable in ancient Egypt. Probably cost more than a house, like a big house. Here's the kinds of stuff it says. It's just a list. If a man sees himself, fill in the blank, good or bad. If it's bad, the word bad is in red. Here's what it means. The whole scroll is just a list like this. Here's the kinds of things it says. If a man sees himself, it actually says this on the scroll. If a man sees himself looking out a window in his dream, that's good. It means he's going to be heard. His prayer is going to be answered. Whatever he wants, he's going to get it. Oh, that's cool. It's not true. Don't buy in. By the way, don't buy into the dream book. They were not right. Okay, if you see yourself looking out a window, don't think, oh, I saw myself looking out a window in a dream. God's going to answer my prayer. No, God's going to answer your prayer because Jesus died for you. Okay, not because you were looking out of the window in a dream. If a man sees himself, wait, did I miss one? This one, okay. If a man sees himself in bed and his bed is on fire, that's bad. It's really bad. It means he's driving his wife away. I think that's the funniest one in the whole scroll to me. Okay? But still, if you see yourself in bed and your bed's on fire in a dream, it does not mean you're driving your wife away, okay? They're not right. Okay, so this is the answer, guys. The reason these dream interpreters, and this made so much sense, this one fact made the whole story of Joseph just click into real life history for me. They can't interpret the dream because it's not in the scroll. These priests don't make things up. It's somebody 3,000 years before them who made this up, or whatever. So they send for Joseph. National emergency. Okay? We know this one guy in the dungeon. Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he'd shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. You can sense the urgency in here. This is a national emergency. The scribes of the house of life don't know what this dream means. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream. No one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. This is stunning that he would ask this of Joseph. Are you more powerful than the scribes of the house of life? Here's Joseph's answer. No way. I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Joseph, I don't know how to describe this properly. No one even talks to Pharaoh directly like this. In the rest of the text, people talk about Pharaoh in his presence. Oh, remember the day when they're afraid to even look him in the eye. He's the sun god on earth, and he kills people all the time. It's his favorite thing to do. Not only does Joseph speak to Pharaoh just like he's a regular person. Pharaoh, I can't do it, but God will do it. He invokes the Hebrew name of God in the presence of a man who believes he's the sun god. Imagine this. Pharaoh grew up believing he is Ra on earth. I am the God. Joseph looks him in the eye and says, I can't do it. Your scribes can't do it. But Elohim, the God who appeared to my dad, the shepherd, in the wilderness at Bethel, he can do it. He's more powerful than you, Pharaoh. What do you think everybody else in the room thought was going to happen right at this moment? Impale him on a stake. Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. So he just starts interpreting it. He doesn't even pray, nothing. They're one and the same, he says. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It's just as I said to Pharaoh. God, not Ra, not Isis, not Osiris, not Amun, not all the Egyptian gods. Elohim has spoken to Pharaoh. He's told Pharaoh what he's about to do because Elohim is in charge of the whole world, Pharaoh. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow. And it's going to be so bad, everybody's going to forget they ever had food to begin with. The abundance of the land won't even be remembered. It'll be so severe. The reason the dream, and this is an amazing statement right here. Here Joseph tells us how he interprets the dream. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that it's been firmly decided by God, and God's about to do it. Why do I say this is Joseph telling us how he interprets the dream? Because if you know his story, how many dreams did Joseph have when he was 17 years old? 2. How many dreams did he interpret for the people, the officials in the dungeon? 2. How many dreams does Pharaoh have? 2. Joseph has learned how to interpret this dream. Probably not every dream. Joseph was not a magician. He was not a scribe of the house of life. He can't interpret this dream because he has some magical power. He can interpret this dream because God has shown him how this particular dream should be interpreted through the circumstances of his own life. When he had a double dream, here's what it meant. It meant God was about to do it. The whole sequence of events started to happen right after he had the dream. And it meant that there was no way out of it. I can't go into that in depth, but when Joseph had that dream at 17, go back to last week's message, he knew it was going to involve great suffering. And he knew God was telling him, there's no other way. You got to accept it. This is how he understands what the doubling of the dream is, how God has worked in his own life before. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and his officials. Pharaoh is stunned by Joseph. Look at what Pharaoh says in the presence of Joseph. I can't even imagine what the scene in the throne room, what it must have felt like at this moment. Pharaoh says in front of all his high officials, the sun god on earth says, "Can we find anyone like this man? One in whom is the spirit of the gods." The text actually says gods there. It's the spirit of God who's in Joseph. But Pharaoh's talking about all the gods he knows of. What is Pharaoh saying in this moment? He's giving the lie. He's saying the quiet part out loud. The whole Egyptian system is really just made up. He's not a god. But in this man, he sees someone who actually knows God. And Pharaoh says, I can't find anyone like this in the whole world. This guy knows God. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the land of Egypt." Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen. Notice the connection. What did Joseph have when he was a kid? A coat of many colors, a special robe. Now Pharaoh's giving him a special robe. Crazy. A robe of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Abrek." They didn't shout, "Make way." This is a guess at what it means in Hebrew. It doesn't mean anything in Hebrew. It's Egyptian. They shouted, "Your heart to you." This is the people of Egypt bowing down to him. They put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. This is a statue of Imhotep. Anybody heard of Imhotep? He's the most famous vizier of ancient Egypt, way before the time of Joseph, actually. But why I bring him up is that this was an official position within the government of Egypt. To be equal to Pharaoh, except in respect of the throne, was something that happened over and over again throughout ancient Egyptian history. There were many people who had that role, not just Joseph. So what happens to Joseph here is not some crazy thing, right? When Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and he puts him on a robe and he gives him a chariot and a gold chain, these were all official symbols of his position in Egypt. And this is actually how they did it. This isn't just Pharaoh going crazy, like, "I love this guy so much, let me give him some gold." This is the way they did it every time. This is what Imhotep had. Same things. Probably about 1,000 years before. I might have just lost my battery here, guys. I got nada. Okay. So there's Imhotep. Let's go to the next one. Saving the nation. Oh, man, we can't really get to this. So we're going to have to do a little bit of a to be continued for next week. But what's going to happen next, just an outline, is that Joseph is going to become this high official. He's going to save the nation. Pharaoh is going to become even more powerful than he already was because he's going to have all the money. Pharaoh does not give away the grain for free like he's some benevolent ruler or like a welfare system. He uses that power to gain control over all the land of the nation of Egypt. He takes everybody's land so that they can live. Joseph is going to become this crazy high official. He's going to look different. He's going to become really an Egyptian and try to kind of forget about his family and all the hard stuff that was in the past. But then years later, probably in his mid-30s, I think it actually tells us in the text how old Joseph is. It's going to get bad enough that his family is going to have to come down and see him. And a whole bunch of chapters in Genesis are devoted to Joseph messing with his brothers. It is absolutely awesome. He messes with them over and over again. He makes them think that they stole gold from him and silver. He gets his one brother, Benjamin, who's his only full brother, who's his dad's new favorite. He gets Benjamin to come down, and he makes it so that it looks like Benjamin stole his cup, the super secret cup of magic that he uses to put into Pharaoh's hand. He makes it look like Benjamin stole it. And he just terrifies his brothers so much. Like they're bowing down before him, all this stuff. But really what we see in the end is that Joseph always knew, he didn't know exactly how it was going to turn out, but he always knew it was going to turn out for good. And in the very end, let's just jump forward, because we'll read that verse a few times. Let's jump forward to Genesis 50, verse 20. So we'll go through this story a little bit next week and wrap up the book as well of Genesis. But this is going to be the high point, almost at the end of the book of Genesis. And really, I think this verse encapsulates the whole book of Genesis. His brothers, after Jacob dies, they've actually been in Egypt for a long time at this point. After dad finally passes away and gets mummified, his brothers all come to Joseph terrified because they think, now that dad finally passed away, Joseph's going to execute all of us. And Joseph looks at them and he says, you still don't get it. 11 brothers, you guys still don't understand. God has always been in control of all of this. When you guys beat me up and threw me in a pit and sold me as a slave, you intended to harm me. But God's with me. No one can really harm me. God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. He weeps and he hugs his brothers who tried to murder him. This is a man who knows God.